On November 18, 2022, a 38-year-old woman walked into a federal courtroom in San Jose, California. 5 years earlier, that same woman had appeared on the cover of Forbes with the headline, "The Youngest Self-Made Female Billionaire." That November morning, the judge told her 11 years and 3 months in federal prison. Her name was Elizabeth Holmes. Her company, Theranos, had been worth $9 billion. But the strangest part of this story isn't how much money was lost. It's that Elizabeth Holmes never admitted she had lied, never admitted she had defrauded anyone. Until the last day of the trial, she appeared to genuinely believe that her impossible technology would eventually work. This is the story of a woman who convinced herself of a lie so deep that she destroyed 800 employees, deceived investors who controlled billions, and put the lives of patients at risk, all while believing she was saving the world. Elizabeth Ann Holmes was born in 1984 in Washington, D.C., into an American elite family. Her father, Christian Holmes IV, worked at Enron before the collapse. Her mother, Noel, was a congressional aide. Holmes's lineage was extraordinary. Her great-great-grandfather had founded the Holmes Hospital in Cincinnati. Another ancestor had been a director of the Federal Reserve Bank. The family had been wealthy for generations, until they weren't. By the time Elizabeth was born in the 80s, the family fortune had evaporated. Her parents lived comfortably, but compared to the family legacy, it was a shadow of what had been. And Elizabeth knew. At 7, Elizabeth designed her first invention, a time machine. She filled entire notebooks with technical diagrams. At 9, she was already speaking Mandarin. At 10, she told her father something he would remember for the rest of his life. She told her father, "When I grow up, I'm going to be a billionaire." Christian Holmes asked her why she didn't want to be president of the United States. She answered, "No, not president. Because the president would marry me, because I will have $1 billion. This wasn't an ordinary childhood fantasy. It was a statement of intent. Elizabeth had found her role models since childhood, Thomas Edison and Steve Jobs, the two solitary inventors who changed the world. Elizabeth collected biographies of Edison and Jobs. She studied them. She imitated their way of dressing, of speaking, of thinking. From age 12, she began training her voice to sound deeper, more authoritative, more like the voice of a powerful man. At 18, Elizabeth entered Stanford University with a Presidential Scholarship. She studied chemical engineering. But something was different. She wasn't there to learn. She was there to build. During her first year, while other students attended parties, Elizabeth spent nights in the laboratories. But what she studied wasn't the class content. It was something more ambitious. Elizabeth had a specific obsession: needles. She had an intense fear of them since childhood, and she began to think, if needles were horrible for her, they must be for millions of people. What if you could do blood tests without needles, just with one drop of blood from the finger? The idea was revolutionary. If possible, it could change medicine forever. Blood tests that were cheap, painless, accessible to everyone. The question was it scientifically possible? Her chemical engineering professor at Stanford, Channing Robertson, would recall years later that Elizabeth had presented the idea to him when she was 19. Robertson told her, "It's interesting, but it's very difficult. It will take decades." Elizabeth didn't accept that answer. For her, decades wasn't a scientific limitation. It was a lack of imagination. In March 2003, after only 2 years at Stanford, Elizabeth dropped out of the university. She was 19 years old, and she had just founded a company she would call Theranos. The name Theranos was a combination of the words therapy and diagnosis. Elizabeth's vision was ambitious to the point of absurdity. A machine the size of a printer, installed in every home and pharmacy, capable of performing over 200 medical tests from a single drop of blood. The problem, according to medical experts Elizabeth had consulted, was that it wasn't possible. Capillary blood from the finger and venous blood are fundamentally different. Performing hundreds of tests with a single drop required technology that simply didn't exist. But Elizabeth wasn't listening to experts. She was listening to an inner voice telling her she could achieve what others said was impossible. And she began deliberately transforming herself into someone who could convince the world. She adopted Steve Jobs' black turtleneck as a permanent uniform. She deliberately lowered her voice until it became an almost masculine baritone. She trained her gaze to never blink during important conversations. Every gesture, every word was a calculated performance. Elizabeth's first real achievement wasn't scientific, it was social. In 2004, at 20 years old, she convinced Tim Draper, legendary Silicon Valley investor, to invest $1 million in Theranos. Without a functioning product, without scientific proof, just with her conviction. But the decisive moment came when she convinced someone much more powerful. George Shultz, the legendary former Secretary of State under Reagan, a man who had handled the most delicate international relations of the United States for a decade. Shultz, at 88 years old, was completely convinced by Elizabeth. He agreed to join the Theranos board of directors, and then he did something extraordinary. He used his influence to recruit other legendary men. By 2013, the Theranos board of directors was one of the most impressive in American corporate history. Henry Kissinger, former Secretary of State; James Mattis, future Secretary of Defense; Sam Nunn, former Senator; William Perry, former Secretary of Defense; Riley Bechtel, construction magnate, and others. What's notable, none of these men had experience in medicine, biology, or medical technology. They were politicians and military men, but their mere presence on the board was enough to make any potential investor or client assume Theranos was legitimate. With that board of directors, Elizabeth began obtaining serious investors. Rupert Murdoch, media magnate, invested $125 million of his personal fortune. The DeVos family, $40 million. The Walton family, owners of Walmart, $150 million, and others. By 2014, Theranos had raised over $700 million. Its valuation was $9 billion. Elizabeth Holmes owned 50% of the shares. At 30 years old, she had achieved what she had promised her father 2 decades earlier. She was a billionaire. But behind the public success, inside the Theranos laboratories, something was very wrong. The technology Elizabeth had promised the world simply didn't work. By 2015, Elizabeth Holmes was the youngest self-made female billionaire in U.S. history. Forbes put her on its cover. Time included her in its list of the 100 most influential people in the world. Glamour named her Woman of the Year. President Obama named her a presidential ambassador for global entrepreneurship. Bill Clinton interviewed her on a public stage. Henry Kissinger described her as a unique genius in a generation. Elizabeth gave TED Talks, appeared at international conferences, spoke at universities. Every audience left convinced they were before the next Steve Jobs. And then came the major commercial contracts. In 2013, Theranos signed an agreement with Walgreens to install wellness centers in its pharmacies across the United States. The promise that anyone could get dozens of medical tests for a fraction of the normal cost. By 2015, there were 41 Theranos centers operating in pharmacies in Phoenix, Arizona, and California. Thousands of patients had received blood tests, and here was the problem. Many of those tests were giving incorrect results. Patients received false diagnoses. Some were sent to hospital emergency rooms for results suggesting medical crises that didn't exist. Others, worse still, received negative results that hid real diseases. The lives of real people were at risk, but the public knew nothing of this. Theranos fiercely protected information about internal problems. Employees signed confidentiality agreements of hundreds of pages. Anyone who dared to speak faced lawsuits. And during this time, Elizabeth continued to be the most trusted public face of Silicon Valley. She gave conferences about the future of medicine, spoke with presidents, was received at the White House, and every day, thousands of patients continued using a technology that didn't work, while Elizabeth Holmes continued receiving applause on world stages. The truth waited to be discovered. In 2015, Elizabeth Holmes appeared on the cover of Fortune with the headline, "This CEO is out for blood." The publication crowned her as Silicon Valley's next great innovator. The internal stock price of Theranos reached its highest point. The company, without a verified working product, was worth $9 billion. Elizabeth Holmes personally was worth approximately $4.5 billion. She received awards, honorary doctorates. She was invited to the most exclusive events in the world of business, politics, and philanthropy. She dined with the most powerful men on the planet. At every public appearance, Elizabeth continued wearing the same black turtleneck. Her voice remained the trained baritone. Her gaze remained unblinking. Every gesture was the same. The performance was perfect. Vogue photographed her. Vanity Fair profiled her. She was invited to the Met Gala. She was considered one of the most influential women in business and technology in the world. But something important happened at this peak. Elizabeth Holmes began to believe her own story with ever greater intensity. In interviews, she spoke about her technology in the present tense, as if it worked today, in this moment, even though she knew it didn't. But the way she spoke was so convincing that she herself seemed to believe every word. Internal employees who dared to express doubts were fired or sued. Warnings from medical experts were dismissed. The entire world seemed to agree with Elizabeth's vision, and for someone who was already half convinced, that chorus was enough. This is a fascinating philosophical question. At what point does a person stop consciously lying and start believing their own lie? For Elizabeth Holmes, that moment came at some point in her ascent, and she never came back. And while Elizabeth reached her absolute peak, in another corner of the world, someone was about to begin investigating. John Carreyrou was an investigative journalist at the Wall Street Journal with 2 Pulitzer Prizes. He had received an anonymous tip months earlier. Theranos' technology didn't work, and he began investigating. Carreyrou contacted current and former Theranos employees. Most were afraid to speak, but some did, and they revealed a story the entire world needed to hear. The reality they revealed was brutal. The Edison machine, The device Theranos had promised the world could only perform 12 of the 200 promised tests, and the few it could perform, it performed poorly. To perform the tests they sold to clients and patients, Theranos secretly used machines from other companies, Siemens and Roche, and then mixed the results to make it appear that their own technology was working. It was systematic fraud, but perhaps the most important whistleblower was Tyler Schultz. His name may sound familiar. He was the grandson of George Schultz, the political patriarch who had made Theranos possible. Tyler had worked inside the company, and he had seen the truth. Tyler had confronted Elizabeth Holmes directly about the problems. She had fired him. Then he contacted his grandfather, George Schultz, and Tyler's grandfather chose to believe Elizabeth Holmes over his own grandson. But Tyler didn't give up. He spoke to Carreyrou at the WSJ. He spoke to regulators. He spoke the truth, again and again, knowing his own family was against him. When Carreyrou's article was published on October 15, 2015, the headline was devastating. A prized startup struggles. Elizabeth Holmes reacted as she always had. She denied everything. She said the article was an inaccurate story by a media company that had never understood innovation. She appeared on television programs defending Theranos. But the truth had been released. And once released, it couldn't be contained again. Regulators began investigating. The FDA, the Centers for Medicare, the SEC, and finally, the FBI. In 2016, the CMS, Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, revoked Theranos' laboratory certificate. Walgreens ended the partnership. Patients received letters asking them to get new tests done because the previous ones could be incorrect. By 2018, Theranos had collapsed. Walgreens had closed all the centers. Investors were suing. The company was officially dissolved, and Elizabeth Holmes, along with her romantic and operational partner, Ramesh Sunny Balwani, was charged by the federal government with massive fraud. The charges were serious. Prosecutors argued that Holmes and Balwani had deliberately defrauded investors and patients. Defrauding investors who lost hundreds of millions. Defrauding patients whose lives had been put at risk by false results. The federal government had built a meticulous case over 3 years. Documents, emails, messages, testimonies of former employees, and especially Elizabeth Holmes' own words captured in presentations to investors and in testimonies before regulators. The trial was approaching, and Elizabeth Holmes, the woman who had once dominated magazine covers and world stages, now faced the very real possibility of spending decades in federal prison. Elizabeth Holmes' trial began in September 2021 in San Jose, California. It lasted 4 months. 11 federal counts, 9 of wire fraud, 2 of conspiracy to commit fraud. The prosecution presented dozens of witnesses. Famous investors testified about how they had been deceived. Former employees detailed the internal lies. Patients told their stories, and the documentary evidence was overwhelming. Emails, messages, false presentations. But the most striking decision of the trial was when Elizabeth Holmes decided to testify in her own defense. For 7 days on the stand, she maintained something extraordinary. That she had never lied, that she had never known the technology didn't work. Her defense had 2 pillars. First, that she genuinely believed the technology would work with enough time. Second, that her partner Sunny Balwani had emotionally and professionally manipulated her, and that he was responsible for the operational problems. The jury was not convinced of her total innocence. But something curious happened. They also didn't find her guilty of all the charges. After 7 days of deliberation, they found her guilty of 4 counts, defrauding investors. But they found her not guilty of charges related to defrauding patients. It was a fascinating verdict. The jury seemed to be saying, yes, Elizabeth Holmes lied to the rich, sophisticated investors who should have known better. But they weren't sure if she had known that patients were being harmed. In November 2022, Judge Edward Davila issued the sentence, 11 years and 3 months in federal prison. Elizabeth Holmes was 38 years old. When she's released, she will be 49. The majority of her productive adult life lost. But the most extraordinary part came after. Before sentencing, Elizabeth Holmes could have accepted a guilty plea deal. She could have cooperated with prosecutors, expressed remorse, received a significantly lesser sentence. She chose not to, until the day of her entry into prison. In May 2023, Elizabeth Holmes publicly maintained that she had been treated unjustly, that her technology would have eventually worked, that she was a visionary innovator the world had failed to understand. This is the most disturbing part of Elizabeth Holmes's story. It's not just that she defrauded people. Many financial criminals have done that. It's that she never seemed to understand or accept that she had defrauded anyone. And here's the philosophical question that makes her case so fascinating. When does a person become a fraud? Is it when they begin to consciously lie? Or is it possible to lie for years genuinely believing you are telling the truth? Elizabeth Holmes's story is something deeper than just another fraud. It's the story of how a person can convince themselves of something impossible and how that conviction can destroy hundreds of lives. The lesson of Elizabeth Holmes has 3 parts. First, conviction is not the same as truth. A person can profoundly believe in something that is completely false, and the deeper the conviction, the more dangerous the lie it defends. Second, charisma is not technical competence. Elizabeth Holmes convinced some of the most powerful men in the world without having real experience in medicine, biology, or medical technology. Her personal charisma was enough to silence technical questions. Third, and most profound, the world prefers inspiring stories to uncomfortable truths. Elizabeth Holmes was exactly the story Silicon Valley wanted to hear. A brilliant young woman reinventing an industry dominated by older men. That narrative was so attractive, no one wanted to see the cracks. Elizabeth Holmes's case leaves an open question no verdict can answer. How responsible is someone for the consequences of a genuine belief? Because in the end, Elizabeth Holmes's story isn't about failed technology or money lost. It's about something much more universal. The most dangerous people in the world are not the criminals who know they're lying. They are the people who have believed their own lies for so long that they can no longer distinguish between their vision and reality. And so, Elizabeth Holmes's story doesn't end with her. It ends with us, with every person who believes in a leader without questioning the cracks, with every investor who signs a check without understanding the product, with every spectator who watches a perfect performance without asking what lies behind. If you choose to witness their stories, subscribe to Rise and Ruin. Next, we follow another empire from glory to dust.